Wonderful. Well, it's great to be with you, virtually at least, and to have some conversation together about practicing faithful innovation. So I think we're all kind of find ourselves, walking sort of a tightrope of challenges in this moment and being pushed to innovate with the pandemic in ways that we probably hadn't expected. So I think everyone's an innovator right now and has learned to be an innovator. And I want to just explore that framework of faithful innovation as a way to think about how to navigate this moment. So if you were to ask people on the street, what's the most innovative organization in the world? I'm not sure how many people would say the church. But I would argue that actually our core business is, in fact, innovation, that God's mission, the triune God's mission, is profoundly about innovation. So, the root of the word innovation is just nova for new. And all the way through the biblical narrative, God is creating new life and working when humans muck things up to renew and reconcile and to bring to completion what God has created. So we think about Jesus as the one in whom humanity, if you will, is innovated, is renewed, and the church is this community participating in God's renewal of the world as the first fruits of God's future, led by the Spirit, right, to show forth to the world a different way of being human and being community together. So I argue actually that our business is in fact innovation, and of course the challenge for churches is, together with all other religious organizations, is that we often imagine innovation or think about innovation to mean a kind of renunciation of the past or simply an embrace of the latest, fad, right? Or even of invention, of having to create something from scratch. So that's where I think we need a different understanding of definition, if you will, of innovation. And I want to share a couple. The first one is from Denning and Dunham's book, The Innovator's Way. And they simply say that innovation is just the adoption of a new practice in a community, the embrace of a new practice. And sometimes it's the rediscovery of an old practice. But it begins really with attending to the places where current practices are breaking down, where they're not connecting, inviting people into a new story, and then, of course, fostering new practices that are more adequate and more life-giving while addressing resistance from those with the most to lose from the new practice. In some ways, we could map that to the process actually of evangelism itself, of joining people in their places of suffering and despair and loss, helping them discover a new and more life-giving and adequate story in the gospel, and then embodying that in new practices, right? So innovation in that sense is, I think we should think about it as a practice, as the spread of practices in a community. And we at Luther Seminary have come up with a slightly different definition that builds on this, where we talk about faithful innovation, right? Because we want the innovation in the church to carry forward what is most life-giving out of tradition, not to renounce tradition by any stretch, but to actually dig deeper into tradition and to make it come alive in the moment. So we talk about faithful innovation as the process of learning new ways to embody Christian identity and purpose in a changing cultural context. So adopting practices and habits that allow the treasures of Christian tradition to speak afresh today. And that often involves the rediscovery of ancient spiritual practices as much as the embrace of new technologies. So I think for many churches today, the core innovation they need to do is actually a reaching back and rediscovering deep traditions that have been lost along the way. Not simply a matter of, embracing the latest tech, although there's a place for that in this work as we go along. So as we begin innovation, I think it's important to attend to which questions do we start with. And as I've listened to church leaders for many years, mostly what I hear from churches most of the time are church questions. How can we get more people to join us or affiliate with our church or our ministry? Or what's a need we can meet in the neighborhood? Or, the classic, how can we grow? And these are, of course, very understandable and legitimate questions. But I think when we begin with church questions, so often we default into eclipsing God, if you will, from the conversation, because these are questions the church can ask without actually reference to God. And we can default into technical fixes. We can default into kind of managerial strategies that in themselves don't get deep enough into understanding the core work before us, or even into the kind of posture of spirit-led discernment that I think is integral to Christian innovation or faithful innovation. So I think it's better to begin with God questions. What is the gospel for us and our neighbors? And I just want to pause on that for a minute, right? Because so often I think it's easy in the church to assume that that's evident. And yet, I think as Leslie Newbegin, his call to wonder about what does it mean for the West to be converted, I think is still very alive and relevant for us today. How do we understand what the gospel is for us and for our neighbors in this moment? And then, of course, what might God actually be up to in our midst today? So, I assume that God is actually active in the world, and it's not about us bringing God to people as much as it is about us joining what God is doing and in the neighborhood. So what might God be up to, both in our midst as Christian community and in the neighborhood? And then how are we gifted and called to join in? So what is our participation, our particular calling, both personally, right, as individuals and also as communities in what God is doing? Now, my experience is if you ask most church people, in the inherited church at least, these kinds of questions, they are often stumped because they're not used to answering them. They're much more comfortable with maybe the church questions. What kind of church program should we offer, or what ministry should we do, or what's a neighborhood need that we could meet? So these kinds of questions involve different practices in the community in order for people to be able to answer them. And that's really what I want to lean into in this conversation today, is what are those practices and how can we think about them within the framework of a larger process that churches and their leaders can take, and an adventure they can take in order to practice faithful innovation. And so I find the framework of human-centered design thinking to be particularly helpful as we think about this, right? Because so often, the way that churches tend to approach innovation challenges is to start with a kind of brainstorming, and then to build some kind of ministry or launch some kind of program that may or may not connect with neighbors. Human-centered design thinking is a way to do innovation that emerged out of Silicon Valley, and it begins very differently, and it begins with empathetic listening deeply, empathetically, compassionately to the people facing the problem or challenge that you're trying to address. Out of that listening, then there's a step of defining what is actually the challenge. We don't assume we know what it is ahead of time. We actually spend time to reflect on that out of the listening that we do. And only then do we move into ideation or brainstorming or coming up with possible solutions. But before kind of building those into full, kind of fledged form, the design thinking process has another step, which is really important, which is prototyping. So making inexpensive, messy, rough versions, right, that embody whatever that idea is, and then immediately testing it with those people facing the challenge or problem. So again, if we think about, say, a more kind of, tried and true church method, often of, say, trying to engage with young people in the neighborhood, so we hire maybe a youth minister, or we start a youth committee, or we start a youth program or a service, right, that we launch. and hope that young people will come. Maybe we market it to them, rather than beginning with who are some young people whose stories we can listen to, and out of that deep listening, begin to actually define what is the yearning in their lives, what is the need, what is the hope, what is the loss that the church can meaningfully address. And then out of that, okay, how do we come up with some possible ways of embodying Christian practice or the gospel with them that will make sense and connect? And then let's try out some simple and messy prototypes with them, test them with them before we invest in, creating a whole thing, right? That's more complex, right? So the human-centered design thinking process is, I think, a helpful one just as a framework to think about. And I want to unpack that relative to the church. So beginning again with listening. Leadership begins with listening, as you know, but innovation also begins with listening. And it's listening actually to the heart, asking what we talk about as hard questions, attending to what keeps people up at night. What are their longings and losses? So often I think that could be things like money, relationships, work. Obviously right now with the pandemic, there's all kinds of uncertainty and anxiety and isolation going on, and fear. What are those things that keep people up at night? And let's lean into those questions. Scott Kermode at Fuller Seminary in California, he has a wonderful new book called The Innovative Church, which I highly recommend. He says that, the challenge though is that most church leaders are conditioned to focus on, to listen to the things that are important to the congregation, rather than necessarily the things that are most important to their people. So again, when you're responsible for managing a congregation, you're worried about, what kind of Advent programming are we going to do, or how are we going to do worship, now that we're online, or, who's going to serve on, whatever committee or vestry or whatever it might be, right? And most people, of course, in your congregation are not staying up at night worrying about those things. You might be, but they aren't. They tend to have other concerns, right? So when the listening is focused not on the things that are important to the congregation, but the things that are actually most important to the people, that is a more fruitful direction. And so I want to unpack a little bit more why this is challenging and actually also really, I think, exciting and interesting in this cultural moment that we're living in right now. And I want to use a framework from the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor in his book on a secular age, and some of the ways in which he talks about secularism in the contemporary West. He says it's less helpful today to think about secular and sacred spaces, right? So there are sort of secular spaces in the world, and the church has its sacred space, and the goal of church leaders and religious leaders is to sort of get people to transfer their time and energy and resources and affiliation to religious organizations, right? And to get more resources into those religious organizations over against, of course, all the secular organizations that are mostly winning in the battle, right, for their time and energy, right? So, youth football or, other hobbies that people have, all those things that, people say, oh, well, they're not in church because they're doing those things on a Sunday morning, whatever. He says that framework is less helpful today than to recognize that we live in this age in which, this culture in which it's very hard for people to sustain belief without it being always somewhat tenuous or fragile. So a secular age is an age in which people are conditioned by culture to seek the good without God. Seeking the good without God, right? So the Enlightenment, modernity, if you say, we might say, made a wager that it's possible to live a perfectly good life without God. And so in, of course, the secular age, the challenge is not so much affiliation or not, or investment in religious versus secular organizations. It's actually much more basic. It's really more about the conditions of belief itself. because daily life is lived without reference to a transcendent reality for most people. And ourselves are understood to be buffered from external spiritual forces. And if people think about spiritual forces more generally, they understand those to be primarily internal, right? And spirituality is a sort of an internal spiritual quest, which makes, of course, all the biblical stories about, the fear of the Lord or encounter with divine power or demon possession or any of those things just really bizarre, right? So the default, of course, then is we're on our own, it's all up to us, and we're not really accountable beyond ourselves. So belief is always fragile in the conditions that we're in today. Now, at the same time, though, unbelief is also fragile as well, because if every believer sometimes doubts, right? It's almost impossible not to doubt. Every doubter also sometimes believes. So just a quick story about my sister. So I grew up in California in an unchurched home, a secular home. We never went to church. I became a Christian, discovered Christian faith as a young adult. My sister didn't. She sort of went on her own trajectory. She would probably describe herself as spiritual but not religious. She's one of these people who lives, I would say, who seeks the good, very well without God. She's, lives a very good life. Several years ago, there was a total eclipse that came through North America, and she and her husband got up early, drove out to the high desert where they live in Oregon, and to be in the path, right, of this eclipse. And she called me on the phone afterward, and she was just speechless, trying to find words to describe this encounter she had had with something that didn't fit, she couldn't explain in her worldview. And to me, it was clear, she had an experience of the glory of God in creation. She was just kind of overwhelmed with the sense of this something sacred breaking in, right? Something numinous, something transcendent, just kind of encountering her in this experience of this eclipse. So, when people, even the most kind of convicted, doubters and skeptics, when a child or grandchild is born, or a strange coincidence or an encounter in nature, these things tend to sort of break open. And so in this secular age, of course, as both belief is fragile, so is unbelief. And there, of course, this, as Charles Taylor says, this supernova of spiritual options for people to explore, mostly disconnected from religious tradition and community. So that's the promising side to it, right? Now, Taylor also says that, starting in the late 1960s in Western societies, we began to shift into what he calls this age of authenticity, or the ethics of authenticity. And in the ethics of authenticity, the purpose of life is primarily to discover and express your true self. And so no one can really tell anyone else how to live, because the source of authority is within the individual self, rather than in external forces, whether it be tradition, institutions, hierarchy, family, even things like that, which are understood always to be somewhat suspect, sometimes for quite good reason. So people navigating the ethics of authenticity find themselves looking to religious organizations or institutions only insofar as they're helpful to their journey of self-discovery, not because committing to and serving them is actually a meaningful way to find identity and community and purpose in life. And so the ethics of authenticity tends to undercut the established inherited institutions that we have received in a very profound way. Now, one final layer on this, thinking about the culture, is that we also live amidst an age of acceleration. And here I'm drawing from the German sociologist Hartmut Rosa, who says, what happens in a secular age where there isn't any transcendent reference to God, the focus becomes on living life as fully as possible by cramming as much into life as you possibly can. So richness or quality of life is measured by the sum and depth of experiences that you have in your lifetime. And people try to accelerate those in order to experience some sense of fullness and even to find a sense of eternity, right? By cramming so much into the time that we have. And even people living multiple lifetimes, in the sense of multiple careers over a lifetime. And the idea that you would settle in one neighborhood or one marriage or one denomination or career or church or whatever for your whole life seems quite odd in this world. So in the age of acceleration, things are sped up by technology, but also by this gnawing sense of insecurity, right? Because there's always competition, right? There's always both a new option, right, the people fear they're missing out on, but also a new disruption that renders, of course, life insecure, and both economically and socially and otherwise. And so the challenge for the church is that it's easy for the church to simply embrace this and to try to legitimize itself by how busy it is, or how much it offers in terms of programming and offerings, and clergy, of course, being caught in that same kind of thing where our own professional identity as clergy is, how busy are we, and how much are we offering, and all of that, all of which can be a distraction, right, from leaning into the core work. So as we listen, I think, in this strange cultural moment that we're in, which is both deeply challenging and also, I think, full of great promise for the gospel, it's important for us to define, what is the core work of innovation? What is the core challenge? And in some ways, I would say it's just rediscovering or discovering the leadership of the triune God. How do we help people learn to be led by the triune God in daily life, in a culture that makes that very difficult, that conspires against that, right? That conspires in some ways to bracket God's agency and presence out of people's imagination and practice in daily life. So I want to share just a framework of some practices that we've developed, I and my colleagues at Luther Seminary in Minnesota, to help congregations take that journey. And it has 3 simple steps: listen, act, share, which is sort of our way to kind of, condense that human-centered design thinking into a much more simple framework. So listen begins with, listening to scripture, paying attention to the neighborhood and God in daily life, listening to spiritual stories. Act is about small experiments, and then share is coming together to reflect intentionally on what happened in those experiences. So let me unpack these in turn. So listen starts with the practice that we found to be the single most transformational one for congregations, which is dwelling in the Word, practice of engaging Scripture together in community imaginatively, and being accountable to a neighbor, to share what a neighbor heard from a text, which disrupts so many of the frameworks of modernity and assumptions of modernity in really, I think, generative ways. Simple neighborhood prayer rocks, asking people, for instance, to just take pictures with a phone of where they see the sacred or God or something that catches their attention in their daily life that might have some spiritual resonance, and then coming back and sharing about and interpreting those. Listening to each other's spiritual stories, simple storytelling, like share a story of a time when you felt most spiritually alive, energized, or engaged. And it's been remarkable as we've done this with, dozens and dozens of congregations, how rare that kind of spiritual storytelling often is in congregational life. So one of my colleagues was in Iowa in an Episcopal church for one of these trainings, and had when he arrived in this sort of church basement, these 3 ladies came up to him, these older ladies, and they kind of said, welcome, and kind of, welcome to our church. We've been here 30 years, and kind of, you're on our turf. Be careful. And so he then, of course, had them dwell in the Word and then do the spiritual storytelling exercise. And at the lunch break, they came up to him, and one of them just had tears in her eyes. She said, "We've been best friends in this church for 30 years. We've never shared these spiritual stories with each other. No one's ever asked us to do this. No one's ever helped us do this," right? So the power of those kinds of really, really simple practices can't be underestimated. So, and then act. So out of the listening, what are some small, inexpensive experiments that are really about investing presence or relationship with neighbors that help us learn more, right? So the point of experiments is actually to learn. It's not to necessarily sort of, impact the neighbor, like, get the neighbor to come to church or to fix the neighbor. Like the most important listening practice, experimenting practice is really around helping us learn, right? So drawing close to neighbors by investing presence or relationship wherever neighbors are, whatever the spaces in the community that exist for connecting with neighbors, and doing some simple experiments. So I'll share just a few stories along these lines. So this was a church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, in a downtown area, an urban area that had been gentrifying, and there was lots of construction, and there was a town festival. And so their experiment was simply putting up a table and a sign for prayers, and putting these strips of cloth out, these colored strips of cloth and markers, and inviting their neighbors to write a prayer and then tie it on the fence. And there was some church people there who could pray with you if you wanted to, but you didn't have to. You could just, silently write your prayer on the strip and put it up. And so they did this during this festival, and they found, to their surprise, that tons of neighbors actually wanted to participate. And so they started to hear from these prayer strips. They took them down after the festival and they read through them, and they began to hear what their neighbors wanted prayers for, what kept them up at night. And so they did it again. And over time, they've done this now to where they've gathered like 400 to 500 of their neighbors' prayers, and even woven some of them into altar cloths. You can see that on the bottom left. So they celebrate the Eucharist over their neighbors' prayers. As a simple practice, again, inexpensive, a way to be present in the neighborhood, to listen to what keeps their neighbors up at night. So in a very rural area in Wisconsin, in a church that's tiny, where there's not even really a village nearby, it's just kind of out in the cornfields. This one team decided that what their experiment would be to set up a table at the grain elevator as the farmers are bringing in the fall harvest, and offer coffee and hot chocolate, and then offer prayers for the harvest, and to listen to their neighbors that way. And so these church ladies Lutheran church ladies in this case, who had never prayed aloud in their lives, found themselves huddling with these farmers praying. And the farmers said, "Well, this was great. Can you come back in the spring when we're doing the planting season? And can you do this again with us?" So that's what they decided to do. There was a small church, really tiny church in Maine, next to a university campus, where the university students, they really had no connection with these students. So they were right next to the campus, but they had no meaningful links with university students. So they were trying to figure out, well, how can we actually form some community with these people? And the experiment was, the university called them one summer and said, when we do our orientation for new students, can we, and we send the students out in the community to do service projects, can we do a service project at your church? And they had been praying on this, and they said, "Thank you, but no. Instead, can we go with the students and join them in their service projects in other places, so that we can work alongside them and listen to them and hear their stories as we go?" So this team of church people split up, went out into the community with the university students so that they could work alongside them and form some relationships. Again, simple, inexpensive experiments that begin to hear more from what's going on in the lives of the neighbor. So another church, this was in New Jersey, they'd been doing a practice of mapping out in their parish hall, with some butcher paper and markers, what are some dreams for our church? And they'd been, people had been writing stuff on it, and it was super fun and energizing. And then someone said, well, wait a minute, what if we took that outside into the neighborhood at a town festival that's coming up this summer, and we just asked people, what's one dream for our community or our town? And we gave our neighbors markers. So that's what they did then. And again, their experiment got them, this new insight into actually what their neighbors were yearning for. So of course, all of these in some ways involve the practice of being hosted, which is, I think, essential as we think about faithful innovation. Rather than practicing hosting, which is important as well, but think about Jesus's ministry was mostly about being hosted, not staying in one place and inviting people into where he was. This is Luke 10 style, getting out and eating what is set before you, looking for the people of peace in the context, which means that we're not in control, we're going in vulnerability, we're relying upon others. So as we do the experiments, then regularly regathering to interpret. So what happened, right? When we experiment without actually reflecting on what we experience, we never really learn from it. And so often I think churches, sometimes when they experiment, will fall into the trap, if things don't go well, of simply going silent about it, out of shame perhaps, or confusion. Instead, to create an environment for us as leaders where it's fine to fail as long as we learn from it. So in that sense, the only failure is not learning from a mistake. So, so intentionally reflecting on experience, gathering teams together, what did you try? What happened? What did you learn from it? And then what might God have been up to in this? Where might God have been opening doors or closing doors? And then what's the next step the Spirit is leading us to out of what we experienced? So listen, act, share. Again, simple way to get people taking steps. So again, I think the key thing here is that people change by adopting new practices and behaviors that actually become habitual over time. And of course, it's best to begin small, on the edge, with a few people who are willing to try things. And our job as leaders is to make it easy for people to do hard things. So the challenges facing the church, how do we discover or rediscover or deepen our capacity to be led by God in a secular age, right? That's an overwhelming challenge for most people. But when we operationalize simple practices that help people learn to listen, try on new behaviors, reflect from them, we can make progress as a community. And that's, and those big challenges become bite-sized, right? So we take them on in baby steps. And that's a much more sustainable way to go. Now, not everyone will initially join in. You may have seen this diffusion of innovations curve at some point along the way. This is just a map of how long it takes people to embrace an innovation or something new in a community. And the research is pretty clear that there's only a small number of people who are actually come up with the new things. But generally in most communities, there's a group of early adopters who are more or less open, and they'll try it on, and then the majorities, and then finally the laggards who are most resistant. But when you get to the 18 to 20% point, the diffusion will spread on its own, the innovation will spread on its own, peer to peer. And so the job as a leader is to find and create the space for the small group of pioneers, innovators, early adopters who will try some things on, and then through their own embodiment of it and their own storytelling, peer-to-peer, influence the rest of the community. So, final thought here, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. What does it mean then to lead innovation, to lead faithful innovation? I think it's a couple things. Primarily, it's to think of oneself as a gardener, as a cultivator of an environment for grassroots behavior change, not to take on the challenge of the innovation oneself, as if it were a technical problem that you can fix for people, but rather to create an environment in which the people can actually experiment, try on new practices, and discover God's leading. So that means both introducing practices that are accessible and concrete and simple for people to try on, also recognizing them when they're already bubbling up in the life of the community, or when they're something that is in the past or the history of the church or the congregation, interpreting what's happening, and particularly doing that in connection to the gospel story, right? So being a theological interpreter that's helping people make spiritual meaning out of what they're experiencing, particularly their longings and losses, and then locating the community in those biblical narratives that are all about God's people experimenting their way into a new future. If you go back through scripture, of course, that's all over the place, from Genesis all the way through to Revelation. And, you know, think about the stories in the Gospels of the disciples trying to figure out, you know, what Jesus was really all about. And Jesus was always sending them out on these little, you know, to try things out and then come back and share how it went, you know, sending out the 12 and sending out the 70. Or think about the narratives in the book of Acts, where again, they're being caught up in this spirit-led journey of experimentation and discovery, where they don't really quite know where they're going. It's no strategic plan. It's a sort of improvisation, right? Of being led by the Spirit, with being prevented and redirected by visions and dreams and encounters that they're having, right? So those narratives are much more helpful, I think, for the moment that we're in today than the narratives of sort of managerial control, where we know where we're going to go ahead of time, and it's simply managing people through to that destination. And then, of course, creating the spaces where people can come together and connect in new ways, and tending the community's formation along the way. So holistically recognizing that this work is fundamentally spiritual work. It's fundamentally about spirit-led discipleship and spirit-led Christian formation. So let me stop there and invite some discussion, and I'll actually stop my screen share here. And
Great,
open it
thank
up.
you very much, Dwight. Really helpful. If people would like to ask Dwight something or make a point, we'll go back to the participants thing and raising the blue hand. So if anybody would like to raise a blue hand, you are very welcome. Any blue hands? Oh yeah, here we go. Mervyn. Mervyn, do you want to ask?
I do indeed. Having problems clicking the unmute button. Just like to say thank you, but also I found right at the end there, the analogy with gardening was very apposite, I think, because we're always told when we're gardening, you've got to grow the right things in the right place. And almost that's the same with a church. You can have the wonderful flowers that you think you really want, but actually if that ground and the conditions are not right for that plant, it's never going to flourish. And perhaps gardening analogies are often used within religion, but I think that your comment there sort of just brought it home to me that, it is almost, it's not necessarily the fruitful ground, it is actually customizing things for the environment in which you're working.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important insight that you're naming. And so to think about the gardening metaphor, fundamentally, it's about tending to the environment, the conditions. And, think about Jesus's stories in parables of the sower and all those agricultural, gardening, growing sort of metaphors that he uses in his teaching. It's God, of course, who brings the growth, but there's often an element of surprise in it and unpredictability, where, we're so clearly not in control of what happens in the garden, right? If you've ever been a gardener, you know that, right? And it's very active, right? A good gardener is fertilizing and watering and pruning and really like paying close attention. And so that sense of just really tending an environment in which people are given permission to try things. So it's best to think about innovation as, lots of saplings, lots of seeds being planted. And just like the parable of the sower, we don't know which ones are going to bring forth the growth. So you're kind of casting the seed, you're encouraging the growth, you're encouraging the possibilities, but also recognizing that, yes, some things aren't going to work, and that's totally normal. And, some of the seed is going to be in rocky soil, and it shouldn't surprise us, and it shouldn't defeat us either. So it's a matter of discernment. What new life is the Spirit bringing forth? And so often I think that's a question of where is the life-giving energy that connects us more deeply with God, each other, and our neighbors. And let's lean into those places and not be discouraged when we find that something fizzles out, because that's pretty normal.
Great. Eleanor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Dwight about the use of our buildings. We're looking in a small village with a historic church. We're looking at opening up the building for community activities. Now, would you see that as trying to pull people across from the secular into our territory? Or is that, as I hope it might be, creating a space for connection? Just wonder what your thoughts are in that area.
Yeah, so that absolutely can be creating a space for connection. So, I think in your context, where there are so many historic buildings that the people in the neighborhood actually like, or they don't want them to go away. They like them as part of the fabric, the cultural fabric, at least of the community. By all means, opening them up creatively as spaces for community connection, and particularly I think in a village where that was part of the historic role of the church, was to be a place of community connection. But then, how might that be done contextually or culturally, where people feel like it's an accessible space, that they don't have to sort of check their culture at the door to enter into, where it's truly a space that's hospitable on that level. And so what that looks like is going to be different in every context and needs to be experimented with and discerned. But I think our buildings are, they're great gifts and assets. I think when they become fortresses that kind of close us off from our neighbors, then we need to do a lot of experimentation to open them up. I think it's when churches only think about, like, how do we get people inside rather than how do we form community with our neighbors. Sometimes the building can be a way to form community, but that might mean some changes, might mean some real experimentation with how the space is configured, or how it's decorated, or how it's used and when, and things like that.
Thank you very much.
Richard Stretch, then Jeremy.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Dwight, the evangelism field for one's relatives is often the stickiest place that you can sort of get stuck. I'm just wondering, with your sister and the experience that she had with the sun and the moon that particular day, did it actually turn out well for her and for you, or was it another problem field that just remained untapped, if you like?
Yeah, so I think what it led to was a great conversation, that we had, where I was pretty clear. I listened to her and as deeply as I could, and I said to her, I think you had an experience of the glory of God, which is kind of, for her, was kind of weird, but I'm like, I'm going to name that. I'm in a relationship with her. We love each other. We have that connection, and I think she doesn't go to church now, but I mean, it's seeds that we plant, and it's witness that we bear. I think particularly when we're free from, feeling like we have to sort of have some particular outcome. I think in my case, my job was to listen to her, to love her, and then to try to help her interpret what she experienced. in ways that, that connected with a larger story. And I had, that this Eclipse thing, some years earlier, she's a breast cancer survivor. And during that experience, where she was actually accompanied by a Christian friend from her workplace who loved her in the name of Christ, actually quite powerfully, that opened her up in some powerful ways too. So yes, I think within families, it is quite complicated. I think we need to let God, kind of be in charge of the outcomes, but also bear witness faithfully as we can.
Thanks, Dwight.
Jeremy.
Thanks, Dwight. It's really interesting and exciting to hear things about the church as a place of innovation. That definitely resonates with me. One question I have, so thinking about that agile word, the Agile Manifesto in software development takes a bunch of things which are seen as almost taken for granted and pairs them with something which is valued more. So we value this more than this. For example, individuals over processes. What would an Agile Church manifesto look like?
That's a great question. So so those of you who aren't kind of don't have backgrounds in software kind of development, the Agile method emerged out of the fact that traditional sort of software development methods, where you would, basically it's called waterfall, where you have these sort of steps that you would follow sequentially. The world was changing so quickly that they found that by the time they got to the end of that process, the software is already out of date. And so instead, what they developed was a process of much more iterative, user-connected improvisation as they went along, right? So that what you ended up with was something that had a lot more user feedback through the whole process, rather than just at the beginning and then at the very end. And so for the church, I think there's something to be learned from that as well. So to me, the word agile itself is, I love the dictionary definition of it, which is ready to move with a quick and easy grace. So the word grace is actually in the dictionary definition for agile, which I think is wonderful. And so it's really, to me, about, a lot of grassroots practices that are where there's a high tolerance for risk-taking and failure, but within, again, the parameters of small experiments, right? So we're not going to risk the whole thing. We're not going to risk the whole budget, or we're not going to blow up our main worship service or something like that. But it's really more about, how can the whole community, starting with some people on the edges, try on some things that help them connect more deeply with God, each other, and their neighbors, and that are in some ways a repurposing of ancient practices. So like dwelling in the Word is just, Lectio Divina in a particular form. The prayer walks and discernment practices they're just, things that Christians used to do naturally, and that in a secular age requires some intentionality. So yeah, it'd be fun to think about how to kind of map that out as a manifesto, and I welcome some ideas on that front. But I think the key thing again is, what is the core work? So one of the things that innovation theory teaches us, and there's a whole jobs to be done theory of innovation that is, I think, quite helpful. And the question is, what work does something do in someone's life? What work does a church do in someone's life? And I think for many legacy members, church is primarily a social and cultural institution. And those are the needs that it meets in their lives. And those are, understandable and legitimate needs, right? But that's not discipleship necessarily. So how do we think about helping the church actually be a community that addresses people's deepest longings and losses, and helps them make spiritual meaning, Christian spiritual meaning, out of the things that keeps them up at night, and then to live out of that story in daily life, right? And if you were to design an organization that was focused on that, you might not design what we've inherited in many places, right? You might design something quite different.
Okay, we've got quite a few blue hands up here. Alison, Alder, followed by Ginny.
I just wanted to share a reflection that I had sort of during your talk, Dwight, because with COVID, we've just had our Remembrance Sunday and our service had to be moved into the Village Hall car park rather than in our beautiful church. But actually, that was an opportunity for innovation and connection with the community, which is beginning to grow seeds, because normally people gathered around the War Memorial and then they disappeared off home and we went into church for our service, whereas they all participated and the community facilitated the event. So I think it's, you know, it's then exploring with God how we build on those starting points that we've been given in these extraordinary times.
Yeah, that's a great story. I love the way that the pandemic has pushed us to try some things. You know, the congregation my wife and I serve has been worshiping in a park all summer. It's now snowy here in Minnesota, so I think we're gonna have to, you know, stop that for a while. But just out in the public in a park with people spread out, bringing their own like lawn chairs, and you know, people are out walking their dogs, and the neighbors, you know, have been coming over, and people have been joining it. You know, very different than if we were inside our building. So I think it's wonderful to think about like what are those experiments, because I think it's just strange times we live in right now. And people are, you know, are open and looking for connection and new ways.
Ginny.
Yeah, just thinking one of those obvious things that I mean, this might be just so taken for granted that it just isn't worth saying, but one thing that's been coming back to me over the day is prayer, and what I've observed over this time is how many people, it's really not our congregations who've definitely participated more in prayer with us when we've put sort of morning prayer online and things, but it's the people outside the church. So most of the people in my sort of past life from all over the place have been routinely engaging in prayer with us. And I think this time when you were talking, Dwight, about non-believers having sometimes believing, I think one of the manifestations of that is when people ask for prayer, and lots of people have asked me for prayer over this time who are not believers, and I think it's a real window into the church. And maybe I think we underestimate it, because a lot of your stories about prayer, we are often surprised about how much people want to engage in prayer, and communities, when given an opportunity, will write prayers and their concerns. As you said, and with the farmers, we're really grateful for the church coming out to pray with them. And it's kind of one of the most simplest, oldest things that we engage with, and does help you come alongside people and find, you know, people will pray about the things, will ask you to pray about things that do keep them up at night. So it's been a really useful way of putting that into some kind of context. Also with what Carrie was saying, Emma was saying, I'm terrible with names, sorry, about prayer revealing what's already there. So all these people who are not believing, we can reveal through prayer, Jesus, God, can be revealed to them through prayer. So, and I actually take a bit of issue with the talk on evangelism, because it's, well, just because it's a bit of a contradiction to say that you want Jesus to be with you and you want to ask him to stay with you, when Jesus is there already. It's your recognition of wanting to stay in his presence, recognizing his presence with you through prayer. So, well, it's just I've got lots to think about now. But prayer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess, Dwight, you weren't here for the morning, so you won't pick up those references necessarily to this morning, I guess. But or will you?
No, but I think the thing about prayer, I think, is really, really important. Like, that's just such a basic Christian thing to do, and it's a great way to connect with people. So one other really quick story on this front. So a different church in Wisconsin, one of their experiments was, this was, I think, back while they were still worshiping in person, but I think they've continued it now. They've been kind of online. Was at the beginning of the service, everyone would pull out their phone and they would text, a few people who didn't go to church that they knew, and simply ask, what's one thing I can pray for you for today? And then everyone put their phones away. And then when they get to the prayers of the people, everyone would sort of pull out their phones and they'd have these texts from their, unaffiliated, unchurched, friends and neighbors and family members. And then they would just incorporate those into the prayer. And the people who were, receiving these text invitations, they loved it. Like, sure, I'd love to be able to share something and have someone pray for me. I mean, who doesn't? Most people want to be prayed for, I think, but not in a creepy way, kind of. So simple ways of doing this, I think, are the key.
Yeah, great example. Leslie, then Jutta.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you. I really smiled when I saw the change curve, because coming from a change management background in business change, in IT and the NHS, it kind of resonated. That's often, obviously, in that role done. You were talking about not being managerial control, and it's very often when we look at change management, it's a being done to kind of change, rather than the listening, developing consensual change you were talking about with faithful innovation. And a couple of other people have commented in the chat, Martin also, about the world of software development, and thinking about how some of those outside experiences we have, how we need to sort of tap into those in how we're looking at being innovative at the moment. So thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, there's so much we can learn from what's going on in other other spheres, other industries, if you will, because every organization is having to learn how to innovate right now. And there's just enormous wisdom that's being discovered out there.
Yeah, and part of the way God is at work in the world, I guess.
Yeah.
Jutta, then Martin.
Thank you. First to say, I loved the way you began reminding us with the word nova, new, being at the heart of what God does, and the revelation in Jesus, making all things new. But my question is connecting with the previous speaker, Chris Russell, who was reflecting on the time we're in, looking through the lens of wilderness, and sort of saying wilderness is a place we usually don't choose to go there, and many of us having a sense this is a wilderness time, and we know how important it is to be in the wilderness. And I'm just curious to hear from you how wilderness connects with faithful innovation, how you connect the two up, and where in the wilderness how we do faithful innovation, or do we not?
Yes, so thank you for that. I think it's I love the metaphor of the wilderness, and actually I did a podcast series this summer. I'm going to put a link to this in the chat, with Stephanie Spellers, another Episcopal priest, using the metaphor of the wilderness as a way to think about what it means to navigate this moment, because there's so many rich, I think, parallels in terms of being displaced from a relatively settled, environment where there were certain rules and institutions that provided certain things, into an environment that is characterized by uncertainty and scarcity, where we need to learn basic ways how to be God's people, right? How to trust in God's provision, through the manna and the water and the rock, how to be led by God's presence, the pillar of cloud and fire, how to practice a kind of radical dependence upon God. And so all of those things, I think, are really, really rich to think about in this moment. And so I think the key thing is that where the innovation conversation, I think, dovetails into this is it's really around what are the practices that sustain us in an environment in which the old rules and the old settled ways of doing things don't necessarily function in the same way, where practices have broken down for whatever reasons, right? And we need to discover new ways of being who we are as God's people. And so, so I think it's a wonderful metaphor. In that link, there's a number of podcasts that we've done at Luther, but the wilderness time is the one that I'm referring to, if you might find that at all helpful.
Thank you. Two more I'll take, Martin and then Chris Iden. So Martin, then Chris, then we'll have to draw stumps, I think. Martin.
Dwight, thank you ever so much. One of the conversations that Mike and I have been having with some of our colleagues is how do we develop an innovative culture in the diocese? And just wondered what your advice and reflections might be on that.
Yes, it's a great question, and I'm excited to hear you say it. So I think a couple things. One is how do we together interpret where we are, right? You know, the moment that we're in and what the core work is, right? So if the core work is in fact discovering how to be God's people in this new moment, where some of the old rules don't apply and are actually really unhelpful. I think it's a matter of giving permission, encouraging experimentation, and then allowing for risks to be taken. I think a lot of the inherited rules and bureaucratic, structures that we've all received can be really, obstacles in this moment. One of the things that we did at Luther Seminary this summer was we did a process of identifying 70 just amazing, innovative leaders from a very diverse ecumenical group, mostly in North America, a few international. And as we've listened to them, so many of them told the story of simply feeling like they didn't have the permission and the support from the system, whatever the denominational system was. So I think giving permission, giving support, and then really creating a learning community, because when we are trying to do this innovation on our own, it's so much harder than if we can do it together. So what we've done with the Listen, Act, Share process is actually teach judicatory leaders like diocesan leaders to gather groups from congregations together to take that journey rather than doing that on their own, so that they can learn from one another and be supported. So if you think about the diocese as a learning community, innovating around these core challenges, what are the practices as a diocese that can make that come alive when you do gather to support the grassroots innovation? Because it's a bottom-up process, but if there isn't a permission and encouragement from the top, it's very hard for it to take root.
Absolutely. Final question, Chris Iden.
Sorry, was muted, not now. Is it coming through now?
Yeah, coming through now, Chris, loud and clear.
Good. Yeah, Dwight, you were talking about us, in order to be innovative, looking back into the ancient wisdoms and traditions that the church has to offer. I'm thinking of probably the most tattooed Lutheran pastor in the world, Nadia Bolz-Weber, and the work that she's done in Denver, Colorado, the Church of All Sinners and Saints, where really it's quite traditional. The ministry that she has, she simply opened it up to people that had for a long time been excluded. I'm really kind of exploring this idea because there is an ancient wisdom that the church holds about all kinds of things, particularly human relationships. Nadia Bolz-Weber seems to be telling an old story and allowing that story to take root in people for whom that story has previously been exclusive. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on telling the old story in a new way, and that the innovation comes from the old story and the old traditions and the old wisdoms being opened up to a whole new load of people.
Yeah, so what she has done, and I think the other places, the other communities that are doing this well are doing is cultural translation. So taking, you know, the unchanging message, if you will, of the gospel, but translating it into cultural forms that are accessible to people. And this is where, you know, the church at its best in mission, it always does this work, right? Because that's the incarnation, right? That's, you know, the word being made flesh, and that is an active translation, as Andrew Walls, you know, has taught. And so experimenting around cultural translation, where again, for neighbors who are not part of the church, don't have a church background, it's not fair to ask them to culturally migrate in order to become Christian. So to say, no, the incarnation is about the word entering into human culture and human context wherever that is, and it's all its diversity. And the church needs to be more creative about finding ways to do that in each place with each community. And so I think she's an example of that, of doing that effectively in her context. And we need a lot more experiments like that in a lot of different places that will look all very different, which is kind of the fun part about it. There's no one size fits all.
Thank you.
Great. Dwight, thank you so much. You always bring a clarity and a focus, a contextual relevance, and a kind of a real grounded, practical ways of taking things forward in terms of mission and innovation. And you have done so once again. So we are really grateful, and especially grateful that you've been able to be with us from so far away, which is one of the silver linings of this cloud of the pandemic.